I'll try to be right to the point. Having said that, I also would, welcome some discussion. It's a little bit tricky. I mean, Roger and Amer were kind enough to share with me some of the content in advance of coming here. So as I thought about, what does this all mean and moving forward, to try to incorporate that, and also try to incorporate just some of my own experience working. I was actually thinking with clients, but also my own company. I'm vice chair of a company called ICF Next. It's basically a brand new company that's comprised of about 8 companies that we pulled together that had been under common ownership. I won't bore you with that whole thing now, but it just made me realize about an hour ago when I kind of thought of it, we're going through our own transformation, and that transformation is driven by exactly what we've been talking about the last couple of days. The need to be able to deliver a much more compelling and powerful integrated suite of services to clients when they need it. And sometimes they need it and sometimes they don't. But we also thought, in terms of recruiting the best people, you need to be able to recruit people who think who will learn a lot and have opportunities to work on a wide range of things. And even if they don't stay forever, and even if they don't work on integrated accounts per se, they'll be exposed and learn that, and so there are opportunities for career growth in terms of really understanding marketing and technology and all the kind of subsets of that, even if they're kind of working, say, in a traditional communications piece of business. It's still going to make them that much more valuable, which I think is going to help make it that much more likely that we can recruit those kinds of people. And that's not unique to us. That's true, I think, for anybody. And at the end of the day, I think we're all basically in the talent game. So this kind of disruption and transformation that we're all going through, I remember, I think John, I think it was at the spring seminar, asked for a show of hands in the audience about who's going through transformation, and it was something like 80–90% of the people kind of raised their hand. I think that transformation has become a great opportunity for people to have permission to make change that otherwise might be much more difficult to make. We see that happen a lot with M&A and some other things where there are clear catalysts for change and people are given permission to make much more change than just the kind of incremental change they would typically make. I think if you don't have that kind of dramatic change, you really want to kind of look for opportunities to kind of anchor the justification for change to help facilitate buy-in. So in any case, I want to kind of go through some thoughts on turning this all into action. I tried to categorize this into basically 3 buckets. One, disruption being the new normal, and particularly in 2 areas. One is around engagement, which we've spent an awful lot of time talking about the last couple of days, but also the disruption of the organization. So I'll just spend a minute or 2 on that. The second bucket is around, we've talked an awful lot about this, purpose and social engagements. I want to kind of talk about, again, making that actionable. And 3, content and data as high-value competitive weapons. We talked about the weaponization of information and so forth, but how content and data really can be a major competitive advantage. Disruption is the new normal. Well, one, clearly industries have been disrupted in rather dramatic ways, financial services, retail, apparel, and so forth. And then around engagement, we've spent probably at least half the time in the last couple of days talking about how engagement has been disrupted and how to do that now. But I wanted to spend a little bit of time also on the disruption of the organization and what it means for the CCO and for the communications function overall. Here's one kind of snapshot that builds off the whole ComTech and tech stack example of disruption. This slide and a few that I'm going to show after, we had just put together, I think Roger had mentioned the other day that we just hosted the Page Future Leaders Group in Los Angeles a few weeks ago, and it was all around digital engagement. And ahead of that, we had surveyed about, well, there were 25 to 30 future leaders coming about their use and the tools that they use within the ComTech stack. We then kind of categorized this, and this categorization goes beyond the 30 people who responded, but this is one way to at least take a look at the information. So we looked at all of the tools and broke them down into content management systems, data and analytics, customer relationship management, social, earned media, marketing, and automation. And I thought I would share with you briefly some of what they told us, because we're going to make these slides available. And you may, in your own organizations, want to see how you kind of match up. One of the things that struck me is the volume of tools that are being used. This, by the way, is the volume of tools being used just by 25 or 30 people, right? So imagine if you did a survey of page membership, you know, you'd have 12 slides filled up with various tools. This speaks to, I think John was just mentioning about, you know, you might be surprised how many tools are being used in the organization, may not even be aware of. I'm going to do a little bit of a deeper dive here to kind of maybe stimulate some thinking or maybe anxiety on your part. You looked at the categories that we mentioned. We then asked the page future leaders, how do you evaluate, or, you know, what's your level of satisfaction with the tools that you're using? And these are the average scores. Those are not particularly compelling. So what you have here is a fragmented landscape with a fairly high level of dissatisfaction. Roger? 1 to 5, sorry. With 5 being best. So I'm just going to do a quick insight on the 4 buckets. So audience engagement, the top by usage are Salesforce, Cision, and Hootsuite. People here use any of these 3 tools? Yeah. The numbers you see, the 984, again, that's the number of people out of the 25 or 30 who said that. But here's what's a little disorienting, and I actually saw this by category, and this might be valuable to you to, you know, take back with you. I'm not going to go through all of the detail, but so we had Salesforce, Cision, and Hootsuite, right? So if you look at that, Hootsuite, one of the top, is down here. Salesforce is over here, and Cision is over here. So they don't even really rank in the top half, yet they're the most popular. Go to the next one, measurement and monitoring. This is kind of Meltwater. Anybody use Meltwater? Headquartered, they're founded in Norway, I believe. SurveyMonkey, Google Analytics. So now look at the satisfaction. Meltwater's at the bottom, yet they're the most used. Again, this is not a statistically valid sampling, right? But on the other hand, I don't know, it may be directionally helpful. Sorry? Is measuring the future leaders' use of these tools and their satisfaction. So what tools are they using and how satisfied are they with them? That's all it is. In content management, Hootsuite, Sprinkler, WordPress. And you see Hootsuite is down here, WordPress at a 3.2, Sprinkler. And the last was employee and internal top by usage. SharePoint, Skype for Business, Yammer, SharePoint. I mean, I know everybody bitches about SharePoint, but Skype for Business, where's Yammer? Down here. You know. So what does that tell you? It tells you there is enormous demand. There is a fairly, I would say, high level of dissatisfaction or frustration. A lot of change that's going to be happening in this landscape over the next couple of years. In all likelihood, a consolidation. But really, not just an opportunity, but I would say a requirement for CCOs to get a lot more kind of invested in technology investments and to drive, you know, the ComTech stack. Any other questions, thoughts on this? Yeah.
So again, back to the marketing parallel, so that consolidation is underway.
Yeah.
And the big thing isn't on the consolidation and marketing is underway, but one of the drivers of that, of the complaint, is around data integration. So if you go back to your buckets, there could be 5 buckets or 50 or 25.
Right.
You need to not have the data locked up in any one tool or system or platform. So Salesforce data has to integrate with Marketo, with Adobe, with whatever. And if they don't, you're going to be limited in being able to engage and understand the target.
I wonder if you have a point of view. I know there was a discussion back during the Future Leader session of there are tools that are integrated tools, and there was a general sense of a frustration that what you get when you buy that is not best in class for any, but better integration. Or you could buy independent individual tools and then take on the integration responsibility yourself, where you have best-in-class tools, but then you have the burden of integration. Do you have any perspective on that?
Just a high-level one. One is sometimes people like the user experience of, when they say integration, they meant the user experience. So I don't have to jump from tool to tool to get my job done. So somebody's put it all together. Like, remember, before there was the Office suite, we bought 1, 2, 3, and then, really dating myself here, and then Microsoft came along and said, no, it's all integrated, right? But what my other point was, if they also have a tool suite that says your data could be anywhere, it could come off of any system, and we can take advantage of it. And if we collect data, it's not going to be locked up in our system. It can be accessed by other systems.
Right.
That should be very high in everybody's RFP.
Good. Other things that are really kind of changing and disrupting, I'm showing an example here of mobile technologies for employee engagement. Anybody here, or many people here, using kind of mobile apps for employee as the primary way to kind of engage employees? It's not as much as you would think. I mean, I would think this is just going to be kind of standard relatively soon. This is an example of CRC is California Resources Corporation. It's a kind of a mid-sized energy company. It was a spin-off of Occidental Petroleum. It's a custom app bought in by the leadership there. All of the communications to their employees comes through this app. There is not just kind of news, but there's also an opportunity for sharing, so people get information they can easily. There are also ways to easily kind of share this on various platforms and so forth. It's, I think, increasingly common for companies that have employees who don't sit at a desk with a computer, but I don't think it's going to be unique to that situation at all. But if you're not doing that, I would start thinking seriously about how do you start kind of engaging people in a much more mobile environment. I think Workplace by Facebook has had kind of the rapid adoption, just because it's, people get it, I mean, there's a lot of moaning and bitching about the other kind of platforms for this, but our sense is Workplace is being received very well by and large, because the adoption rate kind of soars, and even at the senior levels it's critical, and we know from experience that if the senior levels don't adopt it, it's not going to fly. Yeah. It's up like 50% from, right? Yeah. There's been lots of talk about agility. Everybody's talking about agility. It's enormously important. The one thing that I would kind of say is it's a learned skill. It's not just be agile. There are things to learn about this. I know we in our own organization have a team of people. All they do is run around the world teaching agility to our people as well as to client organizations. I've always kind of thought that if you run a communications organization in a company, you're running a basically an in-house professional service firm. And if you're running a regular professional service firm on the outside, in an agency, whether it's a McKinsey or a PR firm or any other kind of firm, you're trying to figure out who are the best people I can deploy, at the right time on the right assignment, right? And companies often operate in much more of kind of I hate to say silo orientation, but it's just much more difficult. I think professional service firms, for a variety of reasons, it may not be easy for them, but it's easier, and it's just kind of part of what the business model is all about. I think increasingly, if you're running the communications function inside a company, you need to kind of be able to have the same thing. Deploy the best talent when they're needed, where they're needed. So if you've got somebody working in some business unit who's really good at issues management, and you've got an issue someplace else, you ought to be able to deploy that person pretty easily. The other thing around agility, obviously, has to do with bringing people together from multiple functions, not just to make decision-making faster, but to make decision-making better. I heard somebody speak just about a month or so ago, a University of Michigan professor, whose name, of course, I'm blanking on, talked about collective intelligence. And there's all this research that shows that, if you get 5 people together and you get 5 good people together, that the collective intelligence of that group is substantially superior than the intelligence or the contribution of the single most valuable player in that group. The example was in financial advisory services, for example. If you work with some great financial advisor and you outperform the market by 8% or whatever, you think that's great. But if that financial advisor got 3 or 4 other advisors from his or her firm together to kind of actually brainstorm and not only do it independently, they'll always get the resources of the firm, but in terms of if they brainstorm and kind of treat their client as part of a team, that the performance went up something like 40%. In any case, the point is there's a lot of wisdom to collective intelligence. Agility is also about collective intelligence. So if you can kind of achieve collective intelligence and get it done faster, it's all the better. It's more and more essential. We're seeing it really being required everywhere. My primary point here is it's a learned skill. It's not just, an aspiration and we should just try to make it happen. There's a skill to learn there. I had kind of mentioned before the war on talent. I was talking a little bit earlier about this. I think this is, unquestionably for our business, the single most compelling need and potential to kind of distinguish yourselves against the competition. I think as we try to attract people, they have increased expectations. This whole issue of being kind of purpose-driven companies are a big driver in terms of obviously what kind of people are looking for. But I think companies, what we see is there is an evolving skill set. John the other day talked about potentially building, kind of a ComTech organization. Well, who do you staff that with? I write a monthly column in PR Week, and I wrote a piece about a year ago, and all the different jobs and job descriptions that there are today that didn't exist a few years ago. In fact, speaking of that PR Week column, I wrote one a couple of years ago that said, if you really want to succeed in PR, get out of PR. And what the story was about was to, get into the businesses, get some experience beyond PR, and then come back into it, That, I think, was the single most widely shared column that I wrote, which admittedly may be a low bar. But it nevertheless, I think it kind of triggered something. And I think it probably supports what Peter was saying before about the progression path. And, you really need to be grounded in the business if you really want to be a business contributor. And integrated solutions, I think, speaks actually to that as well. The need to really, it's what I was saying before about our own transformation at our company. We need people, even if a client doesn't hire us to do anything more than a communications assignment or marketing or whatever, you need people who understand how they fit into the total mix when they're dealing with a client. So these, being able to attract people and then train people to understand everything that we're talking about here is just going to be that much more important. I think managing this increased complexity requires a lot more governance. That's true for a lot of kind of proactive, positive things, but I think it's also true to prevent some things too. What I put here is some rogue subcultures. The Wells Fargo, at the risk of oversimplifying this, the Wells Fargo crisis was largely driven by a culture that really placed a disproportionate premium on financial performance on a quarter-to-quarter basis. And the message that was given to branch managers and the leadership of that company was, in effect, come hell or high water, you need to make your numbers, And the leadership of the company they just don't really want to know exactly how you did it. They just want to make sure you did it. Well, that's a huge problem. But it's also, I think, and you can draw your own conclusions about Boeing, which again, I think had, competitive pressures from Airbus, financial targets, and so forth. That's a problem, but it's really a huge opportunity, I think, for communications people who are kind of focused on culture, on corporate character, kind of preemptive basis to be able to kind of search for that and to make sure that the communications that's happening, that the way the culture and the values of the company are being interpreted are really protected long before this ever kind of blows up. So, let Wells and Boeing maybe be kind of a warning signal. You never really want to get there. Yeah.
Can I maybe add one point on this, because I totally agree.
Yeah.
Sorry, I have a collection of newspaper headlines which blame culture for mistakes, right? And, it's growing very fast. It's almost like everything that goes wrong in a company, journalists interpret it as the culture.
Yeah. Yeah.
To your point.
Yeah. Well, culture contributed to it, but it wasn't limited to culture. Okay, so that's the first large bucket. Second, around purpose and social engagement. And by the way, I have here, happy to share with you, in kind of preparing for this, I just did a quick scan of articles around kind of purpose-driven. There is so much being written now about purpose-driven companies that you can read from the New York Times and Forbes to EY, Deloitte, and yada yada yada. So there's a lot, and I think it's actually helpful to read that stuff. B, you also may find that some of those pieces are worth sharing with the leadership of the company. So worth kind of thinking about. Okay. I have a feeling this probably the circle of death on the slide. So purpose, number one, we talked a lot about purpose of this thing, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but there is a quote from Dov Simon. Anybody know Dov Simon? It's in Forbes. He's often quoted by Tom Friedman in the New York Times and so forth, which I thought was actually kind of interesting and maybe valuable and helpful to you. In a world that is so disorienting, it's natural that people are looking for something to cling to, a foundation upon which they can find sure footing and, find sure footing and build better, more sustainable bonds with others. They're seeking an alignment between what they do, who they are, and what they stand for. They're searching for a means to simultaneously build resilience to disruption and develop a path for growth. Accomplishing any of this requires a deep sense of shared purpose, a collective understanding of your company's primary aims, and a reason for existence. And I thought that was actually a really good kind of explanation, written in plain English, not kind of corporate speak, that helps to kind of explain the value and the importance of being a purpose-driven company. It's not too big a leap from purpose to societal pressures that we talked about, whether it's in France with the Yellow Vest protests or Brexit or everything that's going on, whether it's on immigration or a host of other things in the United States. And what pressures does that kind of place on the company? We talked a little bit about Larry Fink, who kind of came out again and doubled down on his, kind of commitment that the purpose of a company is not only to make profits, and that purpose is actually the kind of animating, driving force behind what a company is all about. ESG, we featured, for those of you who were at the annual conference last year, we featured a panel on ESG and had the woman who's in charge of this at BlackRock lead it. In fact, I think, Paige, did you say that you now are talking, this is Michelle Atkins, right? And just to make sure there's clarity, when we talk about ESG, I think it's one of those things that's an opportunity for CCOs to once again find a way to sit down with your CEO and others and really engage in some serious business conversation. I mean, to me, this is kind of a bridge to help elevate the function in a lot of organizations. So when we talk about ESG, some of the things we're talking about, like in the environmental space, we're talking, what are the company positions on climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, resource efficiency, renewable energy? In social, human rights, gender pay equality, pay disparity, lobbying disclosure, diversity. In governance, independent chairman, adopting majority voting standards, supermajority vote requirements, right to call special meetings. I mean, there are so many things that touch on what we do that now suddenly is kind of front and center for the CEO and for the street. So I just kind of think ESG is not just something that's going on out there that we need to be aware of. I actually think it's a stepping stone and an opportunity for CCOs to kind of take advantage of to engage in more kind of business-driven conversations. Some of you may have seen this to kind of just support all of what I'm talking about. Just a week or two ago, the Wall Street Journal, this is, I think it was just about a week or so ago, had this special section, the future of finance, startups target millennials with social investing apps. In other words, this is not a trend, it's a trend, but I mean, it's not a fad. This is not going away. So the idea of social investing and having a company articulate its purpose, its role in society, being prepared on all of the issues we talked about has become absolutely essential. And hopefully a lot of these things can maybe help us collectively build the case, if we need to build the case, to leadership. The third major category I just wanted to kind of talk a little about for a minute is content and data as high-value competitive weapons. We've talked a lot about this. We've talked about fake news. We had a whole session yesterday about that. I think the consequence of that goes back to the heart of what, corporate character is all about. I see Richard Edelman is just kind of, well, I don't know when he released the 2019 Trust Barometer, but the Trust Barometer is showing that there's more trust now in your employer than in most other outlets, right? And that creates an opportunity, not just for your own people, but there now is kind of a hunger for credible information. And I think those companies that have reputations for integrity and then wind up in difficult situations have the benefit of the doubt then when they have to kind of communicate to their environment. So here's, I think maybe Roger, you may have mentioned, or somebody mentioned GE reports yesterday. Somebody mentioned GE reports yesterday or the day before. I think GE and a bunch of other companies have done a very good job of understanding their role in kind of publishing across multiple platforms, using lots of different techniques and kind of getting their message out there in a compelling way. And then J&J, J&J's been kind of caught up in this controversy around talc and being caught up in some substantial litigation, and they have taken a very aggressive, high-profile posture kind of fighting this. Not dissimilar, totally different issue, but not dissimilar to Dave Sampson and Chevron and where they kind of took on the challenges down in, not Venezuela, in, where? No, not Colombia. Why am I blanking? What? Ecuador, right. But J&J, did anybody see, all the ads and all the kind of stuff that, the content that J&J put out? It's actually worth doing as a case study. Same with Chevron as well. But the credibility that the company has permits this, not only with their employees, but with other stakeholders. So that's why all of these things are so interconnected. If you've got that kind of purpose, if you're really kind of having a positive impact on society, and then you have to kind of deal with these kinds of issues, you get the benefit of the doubt. J&J, not to dwell on J&J's kind of challenges, but several years ago, you may recall, at least in the United States, all of their products for children were taken out of stores for like a year and a half, right? So if you were a parent and you were, would give your baby or child, baby Tylenol or whatever, this was no longer available. For most companies, that would have been a disaster. They survived it remarkably well. And again, I think it goes back to kind of the integrity and the reputation that the company has. And better data, I think, clearly makes us capable of making better decisions. So again, it's just kind of an encouragement to double down on the tech stack and getting the kind of data that we need. I'll give you an example with Delta Airlines. Delta found, based on analyzing the data, that a lot of the stories that they had put out on new features, new routes, new chairs, new, all the various things that they do, were getting relatively modest levels of kind of pickup and traction. But what they also did was study other companies and realized, this may in retrospect be obvious, but that stories that were full of emotion and much more personal had much more traction. The number of likes, the number of shares, the amount of attention it got was substantially greater. So they made a major, substantial, fundamental shift in how everybody in that organization started writing anything, whether it was for, kind of social media or kind of traditional media. They just made sure that every story, if they were going to introduce new chairs, it took it from a personal perspective, introduced emotion, introduced kind of through a customer lens, and the kind of pickup, the traction, and so forth, dramatically increased for them. It's not like a dramatic example, but in its own respect, in its own way, it is. It's the data that drove them to realize they needed to change the way they needed to do things. This is an example of something I would call an issues escalation index. One of the challenges that I think a lot of companies have when they're dealing with an issue or a potential crisis is there seems to be this binary choice of do we engage or not engage. It's kind of a yes-no. And obviously it's not a yes-no consideration. It's entirely nuanced, and it's entirely based on what's going on in the market and what's the right reaction. Data can help you create an issues escalation index that informs how you react. The evaluation of the issue used to be primarily, at least the communications or in the PR world, was primarily driven by media coverage. But that's a really kind of small sliver of the total pie. So the data now you can get not only from the marketing folks, but also, how many calls are coming to the 800 number? What's the impact on sales? What's the street saying? you can collect all sorts of data in a real-time basis, and based on how you get that and how you weight it, you could create an index that you can change on a daily basis if you're in the middle of a crisis, or on a weekly basis if it's just kind of percolating. And where you plot out on an index, in this case it's a 0 to 100 scale, might inform you that A, you don't need to do anything other than kind of monitor it. It might inform you that you really need to kind of reach out to your employees and maybe board members, but that's enough. And as it kind of works its way up into maybe a greater threat, you get guidance based on the index in terms of what kind of communication should be out there. The capacity to kind of go and have a conversation with a CEO about the level of visibility you should take on about an issue that's percolating, which is always a really difficult issue because everybody says they want to get out in front of an issue, but by doing so, you kind of escalate the issue a little bit. There's a calculation there that getting ahead of it is the right thing to do. Having data to support that decision making, makes that decision a hell of a lot easier. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just triggered by your previous slide, and unless I missed it, if you can put it back on, is it okay?
Which one?
Yeah, this one, because there's two figures there, and I'm kind of wondering why that's there.
Oh,
because I hear about the data, but I think some of the examples we've seen is that they knew gut-wise or heart-wise what they needed to do without the data in place. And I was wondering whether that was what you were trying to communicate with that image or not.
Oh, no. Well, what I'm trying to get at is with the hearts on the left is just much more emotion in the story. That's all it's trying to communicate.
So then I'm going to a little bit dwell on my point, if you don't mind. Because there's a lot of wisdom. You talked earlier about the collective intelligence.
Yeah.
There's wisdom that we have. And the data, I'm not going to undermine the data point. Obviously, we all know the importance of that. But what we forget is the wisdom that we carry. And I think that's a fundamental one in certain things. We just know what to do, what's the right thing to do.
Right.
And sometimes we react too late because we think we need to be convinced by data. So we take the cognitive route rather than the other one.
Yeah, fair enough, fair enough. So in any case, so the final part on the index is just data can be your friend in A, developing a strategy, and B, having a conversation about how visible the company should get to get ahead of an issue. Just another example of the use of data. This is an example that Linda Rutherford shared at the Page conference on Southwest models. Southwest was asked to comment on, this is about a year and a half ago, on the Defense of Marriage Act in the United States, which at the time was legislation that was trying to go through that marriage was only between a man and a woman. And they were asked to sign a petition to protest that. And they decided not to do that, not to sign it, because they said regardless of what happened on the legislation, that their employees would be protected regardless of, whether it was heterosexual, homosexual, made no difference. So they said, well, we're protected, so therefore we're not going to sign it. Well, sure enough, it kind of got them into trouble because, they were approached by a number of groups asking why they refused to sign it. They realized at the time then they needed a much more kind of thoughtful, deliberate approach to how they were going to make decisions on topical issues in society. So you see this chart here, which starts to take a look at, particularly in the bottom half, business impact, employee impact, customer reaction, public perception, timing, brand reputation. What's not in there other than, you see it in guiding principles, which is probably the most important thing, is that their own set of values. How do their values match up to the issues that they're kind of dealing with? And so what they're able to do is by having kind of a framework, they could instantly mobilize a cross-section group of people and make decisions on how they were going to get engaged on an issue or if they were not going to engage on an issue. So the idea of kind of creating these kinds of frameworks and help guide decision-making is something, particularly as companies are getting pushed to take more and more stands on all of these kinds of controversial issues. Could be gun control, could be any number of things. Having a framework can be helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, Bob, I just want to add on the Southwest story. When Linda told it, she mentioned that comms wasn't consulted at all on the decision. So she got a call from her CEO saying, why did we not agree to do this? And it was news to her. And so this process was as much as anything about making sure there's an integrated process for thinking across the organization what the implications are.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, it goes back to the governance issue to make sure there's a process for engagement and consideration. And she's agreed for making that public and to share that framework. So just kind of quickly putting it all together, the three buckets. One, disruption is the new normal. What does that mean? Think different, look for opportunities to be a catalyst for substantial change, not incremental change. We didn't really talk a lot about this, but powerful integrated creative, I think in a really cluttered environment, great creative is what breaks through. Seems as though there are 10,000 people from our industry right now in Cannes, or at least it seems that way in my Facebook feed. Great creative is what breaks through. Consumer-friendly employee tools, which with an emphasis on kind of mobile, I think is a major trend. This commitment to ComTech, really understanding technology, whether you ultimately create a kind of a technology or kind of a ComTech organization or just invest heavily in it with the resources that you have, there's a huge need to kind of, for that area to get a lot of attention. Because you saw through the tools that I shared with you, a lot of investing is going on they may not even be aware about, and it's probably inefficient. And then on top of that, there'll need to be more. Total talent review. I'm on the board of the Annenberg School at USC. And we had a meeting about a year ago, and somehow the issue of talent and compensation came up, and I had asked people what they were paying entry-level people. And the answer was somewhere in the neighborhood in the US of $45,000 a year. I said, well, that's okay, but then don't complain about talent, because if you're trying to attract people either at undergraduate or graduate school, and they're looking at a consideration set, and they have opportunities to potentially pursue career paths that are going to make a hell of a lot more money and maybe just as, if not more, intellectually stimulating, that's tough to do, right? Our business model, at least in kind of the agency world, is I think, broken, So we need to kind of take a look at what kind of talent do we need, how do we compensate those people, and make sure that we're well positioned for the future. Because I think this whole transformation that's going on is an enormous opportunity for the communications function generally and for CCOs in particular. But the flip side of that is it's also a huge threat. Because I think increasingly, we've already seen this trend, the communications and marketing organizations are increasingly reporting to a common person. Now, I didn't say to the CMO, I just said increasingly to a common person. I think the CCO has the opportunity to be that common person. The CMO has the opportunity to be the common person. Somebody else has the opportunity to be that person. It's going to be a talent-driven decision. So I think for the function, there's huge upside, but we really need to kind of take a look honestly at the talent we have in our organizations and make sure we just kind of pursue a path of continuous improvement. An agile workforce we talked about, and constant integration, which is just not going to stop. 2, around purpose and social engagement. Actively engage with ESG. I think ESG, as I said, is a bridge. It's an opportunity to deeply engage with the C-suite on stuff that's really important to the business and help to kind of elevate the function. Staying attuned to stakeholder interests. Courage. There are a lot of examples of companies that have demonstrated some courage. Somebody mentioned Levi Strauss the other day in terms of their stance on gun control. It's kind of in keeping with the DNA of that firm, but it still takes a certain amount of courage to do that. Privacy and cyber threats. Didn't spend a lot of time talking about that, but I think both of those issues are just so enormously important to companies, and they're going to be subjected to all sorts of scrutiny, whatever industry that you're in. And I'd say also in cyber, there's a whole business out there in terms of people helping companies deal with the cyber threats and the reputational impact of that. So if you don't have people kind of really looking at your vulnerabilities in the company, I don't mean just the cyber vulnerabilities, but the reputation vulnerabilities from what happens from a cyber attack, you should probably do that. I mean, I remember spending some time with Brad Shaw, who's the former CCO at Home Depot. They had a major attack. And, he said, and I think he's right, there are 2 kinds of companies, those that know they've had a cyber attack, and those that have been attacked, but they just don't know it yet, Three, in the third bucket, that the function overall just really needs to be data-driven. And a lot of CCOs, I think, are not, kind of data-driven CCOs, but we kind of need to intellectually embrace that and make sure that there's somebody in a leadership position in that company who's helping to make sure that data is driving the decision-making for the organization, obviously supported by, wisdom and judgment and so forth. A real-time orientation, one of the challenges we see lots of companies face, this is where agility comes in as well, is, a lot of companies they're not comfortable moving really fast. And I think we've had a couple of speakers over the last couple of days talk about that. We need to be able to be in a position to kind of have real-time decision-making for communications externally as well as internally. And then this big opportunity around publishing, engaging, and activating as a way to kind of participate in dialogue and create engagement with stakeholders and not be completely dependent upon, the media landscape that we don't control. So those are kind of the major buckets that I tried to take a lot of what we had heard in the last few days and then maybe add a little bit in for some perspective, maybe have a checklist on some things there, and we'll share the deck with you. And if it's helpful, particularly around the tools and so forth, all the better. Any questions? Anything else? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I just want to remark. I was fascinated by one of the slides you showed about corporate what was it? Something like corporate reputation management or something. And then it said climate, social, and governance, right?
Yes.
And I think we really have to seriously look at that because into my experience, I'm responsible for corporate comms, but I'm also responsible for the whole sustainability and social agenda of the company, which is a lot about numbers, I can tell you, and a lot about KPIs, targets, big aims for the long term.
Right.
Of course, it ends up, if you do this well, in reputation.
Mm-hmm.
But you do not do it for reputation at first. You basically do it because in your corporate character or in your purpose as a company, you realize that you're part of society and you have to do all these things because you found out with your stakeholders that they think those things are important. You find them important from your point of view, from your purpose. That's why you do it.
Yeah.
And it results, in the end, in a better reputation.
Yeah.
We have to be careful with that because I think if we put it in reputation, then it becomes much more the activism for media attention, the activism to become, to have a better shield, so to speak, with the word we used in the discussion here, instead of really doing something because you firmly believe that that is your role in society.
Yeah.
So I think that we have to find new words for that somehow, whether it's social impact or being citizen in this world of today, stuff like that.
Yeah. Good. Anything else?
Yeah, sorry, just something that I was thinking about as you were going through the slides, and I think they're all relevant and all important. I think for a question from my side is how do we prioritize and manage all of that? Because a lot of this stuff is almost new thinking. And we talked about this when we were talking about the Comtech earlier on. It's navigating the organization to shifting their mindset. It's talking about new ways of doing things. How do you do all of this, plus do the stuff that is expected of you?
Yeah. It's a really good question. I'm not sure if this will be an adequate answer, but I will tell you that I often see that communications organizations and companies don't go through formal annual strategic planning. They may produce plans to support the businesses that are required, but in terms of the overall function, some do, some don't. I would encourage you to formally do strategic planning. And one reason is exactly what you're asking. It can create a roadmap and help you to step back and prioritize and say, okay, what needs to be accomplished in the first quarter, in the first half? What can we do this year? What's a year off? What can we afford? And so forth. Absent the formality of strategic planning, it becomes, I think, A, a little overwhelming, and B, becomes probably also a little bit difficult to kind of budget because it's just a little chaotic. So, that's just one thought. I don't know, anybody else have any ideas? I don't. We good? Okay, look at that. with 10 seconds to go. I think I'm turning it over to Aimer, right? Okay.
Thanks. So I got the privilege of closing out what has been a fantastic conference with